If you value thoughtful, honest conversations about the Orthodox world, subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. You'll get frequent essays, episode notes, and occasional behind-the-scenes reflections that expand on what you hear on this podcast. It's free to join, and if you choose a paid plan, you directly support independent Jewish media and help keep me producing these conversations. Take 10 seconds right now to search for Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack and hit subscribe, or click on the link in the description of this podcast. Thank you for being part of this community and helping us grow. Now, let's begin today's conversation with Alyza Lewin.
These were students who had grown up their entire lives outside the Jewish bubble, had gone to Jewish schools, didn't belong to synagogues, but there was something in their past and their upbringing that made them feel connected to the Jewish people and made them feel that that connection was also rooted in Israel. And now suddenly they were being told when they wanted to be involved in theater groups, LGBTQ groups, climate change, immigration issues, women's rights, whatever the issue was, they were suddenly being told, well, wait a minute, you're that kind of Jew? We don't want you.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. There is a fundamental mistake that many people make about Jews. They see Judaism as a religion only. So they assume Jewish needs are basically religious accommodations, kosher food, absences on holidays, maybe a place to pray. But my guest today, attorney Alyza Lewin, argues that if that's your starting point, you completely misunderstand the nature of Judaism and what Jews are experiencing across the world. Because what we're watching on Bondi Beach, on campuses, and in the international vilification of Israel is a targeting of Jews as a people on the basis of peoplehood, ancestral heritage, and our connection to the land of Israel. And those who do so likely don't even publicly acknowledge that this is their philosophy of Judaism. And that, of course, itself is part of the problem. People who are not Jewish, who think that they can define Judaism and Jewishness. It's a process that's happening now, but it has antisemitic roots that go back 800 years. That's part of why the chants and the intimidation land the way they do, and why the world's inability to even recognize the nature of these attacks has left so many Jews feeling isolated. Strangely enough, Alyza argues that despite the pain, there is a silver lining. Namely, the reinvigoration of Jewish identity, of Jewish peoplehood, along with faith in God, among many of those who, until October 7th, gave very little thought to their Jewish heritage. So in this conversation, we address a series of very practical questions rather than dealing with anti-Semitism in the abstract. We ask how, in a society with broad legal protections for free speech, we should deal with the huge gray zone where speech has consequences the law may not address. How do we distinguish good faith political debate from the vilification of Jews, especially when universities watched this for years and still misread it as normal dialogue? What should Jewish students do when activists demand that they shed Jewish peoplehood and connection to Israel in order to be accepted? And why does Alyza insist that the answer is not to take the bait, but to say clearly, you have no right to tell me what it means to be Jewish? Should we retire the term Zionism or reclaim it? And crucially, we also tackle one of the most emotionally charged pairings in today's discourse, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and how that framing often shapes and, at times, distorts the conversation in the public square. Ultimately, we have to reinvigorate Jewish peoplehood. Because if we do not define ourselves as the Jewish people clearly, we will keep losing the argument before it even begins. We'll get to that conversation in just a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at Alyza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Alyza Lewin is the president of U.S. Affairs for the Combat Antisemitism Movement, where she leads the organization's American operations and oversees strategic engagement, programming, coordination, and collaboration with government, educational, and civic institutions nationwide. Prior to joining the Combat Antisemitism Movement, Alyza served as president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, where she spearheaded landmark legal and advocacy efforts to protect the civil rights of Jewish students and employees across the United States. A distinguished attorney and co-founder of Lewin & Lewin LLP, Alyza has dedicated her career to defending justice and equality and to forging a deeper public understanding of antisemitism in modern-day society. Alyza Lewin, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Scott.
After Bondi and 2 years of campus and street intimidation, I think we've discovered that freedom of speech has consequences in ways that the law may not actually address. There obviously is protected free speech. Then there's actively encouraging violence, which I presume is not permitted. But then there's a big area in the middle where you have phrases such as globalize the intifada, which could be understood and often is understood as a call to violence, whereas others, such as the mayor-elect of New York, will say that's not what it means something else entirely. Or, for example, a couple of weeks ago at the Nefesh B'Nefesh event at Park East Synagogue in New York, where there were chants of we need to make them scared or something along those lines. Also, at least there are rumors that in Australia a couple of years ago, it's unclear exactly what people said, but apparently in Sydney, people were chanting, "Where are the Jews?" or maybe "Gas the Jews." So my question really for you is, at least in the United States, what can a society on a legal level like the United States do where it has such broad legal protections for free speech, which I am very broadly in favor of. I think that's a good thing. And yet there's this big area where we see that speech has consequences in ways the law may not address.
I think the first thing is that we have to be able to recognize the difference between what is actually a good faith political debate and what is the vilification of Jews. I think that has been now for a long time in the United States, one of the greatest challenges that we have. And I saw it on university campuses already a decade ago. For years, before October 7th, for years, we already had people who were out there shouting the slogans that were not because they wanted to actually engage in a conversation about the Arab-Israeli conflict or talk about, for example, is it apartheid, right? Years ago, you remember the apartheid walls. Does it actually meet the definition of apartheid? They couldn't care less. They were doing this even back then because they wanted to equate the Jew with evil. And what happened on October 7th is it was as if dry brush had been spread across all these university campuses because for years already, they had been hammering into people's head that the Jew, namely the person who feels connected to the Jewish people and who feels as a part of the Jewish people that their ancestral heritage is rooted in the land of Israel, that's where their history of their people is rooted, those folks were to be treated as pariahs. They were the equivalent of evil. They should be shunned. They should be marginalized. And let's just start with the campus because now it's spread beyond the campus. But if you think about how university administrators looked at this, they never understood the Jews as a people. They never understood that for them, what was Jewish students on their campus? Jewish students on their campus, they saw Jews as purely a faith defined by religious practice. So an administrator on campus would say, what does my Jewish community need? Well, maybe some students might need kosher food. Maybe some students might need a Yom Kippur accommodation, right? That was it. The idea that you had a group on campus that could be targeted on the basis of their peoplehood and their ancestral heritage rooted in the land of Israel, that was something that never crossed their mind. And what you have happening today is the targeting, right? The vilification and the targeting of Jews on the basis of our peoplehood. And after October 7th, for many Jews around the globe who might not have defined their Jewishness by religious belief and religious practice, what October 7th awakened in them was a sense of Jewish peoplehood, right? And they started to feel even more connected to the, not just to the Jewish people, but to the Jewish people in Israel. They viewed what happened on October 7th as an attack on Jews in our ancestral homeland. And the fury right, that followed, and what made the Jewish community feel so isolated was that instead of the rest of the world recognizing that this had been an attack on the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, people started to celebrate those who were responsible for this barbaric attack. So now when you go and you talk about speech and you talk about what's protected, the problem starts with the fact that those who are either in the courts or the administrators or the general public, they don't even begin to understand how October 7th impacted the Jewish people as a people. They don't begin to understand and see why when you say globalize the Intifada, when you support Hamas, when you say that, resistance by any means is justified, when you're calling for more October 7th, what you are doing is targeting the Jews as a people, and in particular, right, this sense of Jewish peoplehood that recognizes that the Jews have an ancestral connection in the land of Israel. So that's the first piece. The first piece, if you want to understand what these terms mean, you have to go back and understand this broader piece.
Okay, so let me ask a little bit about what you just said, because when you describe Jewish peoplehood, I assume that's a reference specifically to the problem of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and I'm not a lawyer. You can answer me if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense. The problem there for Jews would be that it doesn't explicitly protect religious belief or those who profess religious beliefs. It protects other groups. By saying the Jews are a people, that would inherently allow us to have protections under Title VI. If we merely are a religion, we wouldn't. Am I saying something that's correct or incorrect right now?
So almost.
Okay. Tell me what I got right and wrong.
Here's the little primer on Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. You are correct. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does not include religion as a protected category. What Title VI says is that any entity that receives money from the federal government, that money comes with strings attached. The recipient, the entity that receives those funds, has to make sure that all the opportunities that they provide are provided in a non-discriminatory fashion. Okay, that means you can't have, and I'll tell you what Title VI actually says. It says here, no person in the United States shall on the ground of race, color, or national origin be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So in the United States, almost every institution of higher education receives some kind of federal funds, which means that private and public, they're all covered by Title VI. And the way the Title VI, right, has been used now, especially since October 7th in the courts, has been to go after the universities and say, your Jewish students are not receiving equal access. The most blatant were the encampments where students were actually physically being blocked from accessing parts of campus and certain administrative buildings, or if their ability, right, to get the same kind of education as others is being prevented. That would make the university potentially liable for a Title VI violation and at risk of losing their federal funding. Now, let's just go back a little bit to the evolution of this use of Title VI. When Title VI was passed, religion was left out on purpose, right? You actually have religion in other sections. So Title VII, for example, which deals with employment discrimination, that includes religion as a protected category. And my father actually was involved in drafting the amendment to Title VII, which made sure that religion in that law was understood to also include religious practice. Because when you originally had Title VII in the employment context, there were folks afterwards who said, well, I'm not discriminating against the Jew. I just can't hire somebody who can't work on Saturday. And so the idea was, no, if you're going to discriminate against a person on the basis of their religious practice, that's also covered by Title VII. Title VI, what happened is there were institutions, including parochial, right, sectarian institutions, who wanted to be able to continue to make decisions based on faith. They didn't want that to be considered religious discrimination, so they said, leave religion out. That was one of the reasons why it was left out. But after 9/11, when there were Muslims who were being harassed and there were Sikhs who were suffering horrible bullying in educational spaces, they started to file Title VI complaints. And if you feel you have a Title VI case, you can either hire a lawyer, go into federal court, and proceed that way. Or the simpler, less expensive way is to file a complaint with the agency that's giving out those federal funds. So in the United States, that would be the Department of Education. And so there were complaints that started after 9/11 being filed with the Department of Education. And the Department of Education initially said, what do you want from us? These are religious groups. This is religious discrimination. The attorney who was at that point, overseeing the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education, this is back in 2004, said, no, wait a minute. He said, if members of faith-based groups are being targeted on the basis of one of these other categories, race, color, national origin, they don't lose that protection just because they also share a common faith. And he at that point set out this understanding of Title VI, saying—
What does that even mean, though? I don't understand.
Okay. So here's what it means. This understanding of Title VI, he set it out in what they call a Dear Colleague letter, which is how they explain how the agencies set out their guidance. It was ultimately adopted, this was in the Bush administration, by every successive administration. In 2010, okay, the Department of Justice set it out in a letter, which I think captures it the most eloquently, and this is how they summarized it. They said, although, and this is a quote, although Title VI does not prohibit discrimination on the basis of religion, discrimination against Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, and members of other religious groups violates Title VI when that discrimination is based on a group's actual or perceived shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics, rather than its members' religious practice. So in other words, if a religious group is being targeted on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity, that's covered by Title VI. If they're being targeted on the basis of their religious belief or religious practice, that's not.
So do you mean that if, for example, someone were to discriminate against an Arab individual based on the assumption that person's a Muslim, but it's actually based on the fact that they're Arab, so Arabs are Muslims, quote unquote, in the popular mind, that would be covered under Title VI rather than a religious test that they give them, so to speak?
It's more that if somebody discriminates, for example, against a Muslim and calls them a terrorist, okay, that has been recognized by the Department of Education to be a form of discrimination covered under Title VI, because that's really talking about their history. That's what was happening after 9/11, is that people were going and referring to them as Osama or claiming they were terrorists. Now I am president of U.S. Affairs for the Combat Anti-Semitism movement as of a little less than 2 months ago. Before that, I was president of a nonprofit called the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law for 8 years. And that's a nonprofit that uses legal tools to counter anti-Semitism. And it started with a focus on the university campuses and moved beyond that. But one of the things that I really helped develop at the Brandeis Center was the framing that enabled the Jewish students on campus to say, wait a minute, when you're telling me that I, as a Zionist, am not welcome, what does that mean? Well, if you look, for example, at the encampments, nobody was interviewing those students at the gate and saying, okay, what's your opinion on Prime Minister Netanyahu? What's your opinion on two states? Their opinion on the politics made no difference. The only thing that made a difference was, were they the kind of Jew that recognized that the Jews are a people, that somehow the Jews around the world are connected, and that this Jew standing here on this American campus somehow felt connected to Jews in Israel? And was this a Jew that likely believed that somehow the Jews actually had a right to be in Israel, because maybe that's where their ancestral homeland is, right? If that was the kind of Jew you were excluded. You were not welcome. So for many Jews, right, as I say to you, the Jewish students on campus, they're like, of course that's what it means to me to be Jewish, right? Many of these students, as I say, were not students who were Shomer Shabbat or Shomer Kashrut. In fact, most of these students, when this was starting, even before October 7th, when I say 8 years ago already, I was talking to students and I would see this, these were students who had grown up their entire lives outside the Jewish bubble, had gone to Jewish schools, didn't belong to synagogues, but there was something in their past and their upbringing that made them feel connected to the Jewish people and made them feel that that connection was also rooted in Israel. And now suddenly they were being told, when they wanted to be involved in theater groups, LGBTQ groups, climate change, immigration issues, women's rights, whatever the issue was, they were suddenly being told, well, wait a minute, you're that kind of Jew? We don't want you.
And let me ask a question, because I'm confused when it comes to Jews, how much that definition should apply. Now, I agree with you 100%, but I'm trying to look at it from an outsider's perspective. I remember, maybe it was a decade ago or more, that there was the president of a local chapter of the NAACP who claimed to have black ancestry. It turned out not to be true. That person became a laughingstock. You can't pretend that you are black just because you feel black. That was considered absurd. When it comes to Jews, calling us a people, again, of course, I agree with you. But we have Ashkenazi Jews. And in the social media sphere, you see people laughing at Ashkenazi Jews claiming they're Middle Eastern when they look like they're Germans or Polish or Europeans in some way. So from somebody who is an anti-Semite's perspective, he can say, I don't care what you feel like any more than I care that the president of the NAACP feels connected to blacks. That doesn't make you black. It doesn't make you Jewish to feel Jewish. And we might say, then what does make you Jewish? They say it's a common belief system rather than a common ancestry. How would you answer something like that?
You take a look at studies like the Pew study, right? And you see that they have categories of Jews that are not just the Jews who define their religion by religious. Like you have Jews who say they're Jews of no religion, right? Even Jews who don't believe in God, right? How can you have Jews who don't believe in God who are Jews? How do we have Jews who don't believe in God who are Jews? The idea of Jewish peoplehood, when you have conversations with, and I did, right, with these students, inevitably they would say to me, because I would talk to them about what does it mean to you to be Jewish? And I would find that it was, why do you have a Passover Seder? You have the Passover Seder because they would believe their ancestors were once liberated from slavery in Egypt and wandered for 40 years in the desert. I remember one student who said to me, we didn't keep kosher, growing up I didn't keep kosher. We didn't observe Shabbat. She goes, but I once played Queen Esther in my temple's Purim pageant. And I said, oh, so you view that as your heritage? Of course, that's my people's heritage. That's my people's history, right? So it meant that they somehow felt rooted and connected to the Jews both around the world today, but also to our history and our heritage, that this was their history and their heritage. And, right, I think it's a common way when there are peoples and ethnicities, this is how they often define, right, what it means to be part of that people. And when you lay that over our religious tradition, so when you then see, right, you cannot separate Zion, Jerusalem, from our Jewishness. I mean, our prayers have been, for centuries facing Jerusalem and to rebuild and return to Jerusalem, right, to Zion. We have our holidays are rooted in the agricultural seasons, right, in the land of Israel. I mean, the idea of Taryag mitzvot, over half of them, right, are specifically connected to the land of Israel. So you cannot separate our Jewishness from the land of Israel and the idea of the Jewish people. I mean, that's what happens with the diaspora and the exile, right? Is the idea that then we are this people scattered around the globe, constantly yearning for this return to our ancestral homeland. And that didn't start in the 1800s with Herzl. That goes all the way back. So the thing is, we actually have been successful, and at the Brandeis Center, we're successful in framing this understanding, right, of Zionism as the Jews' shared ancestry and ethnicity. And we had, for example, a case that the Department of Education heard. This is in 2023. The case was brought in 2020, but in 2023 it was decided. Before, this is in the end of April, and it was a case at the University of Vermont. So I guess it was filed in 2021. And a case involving the University of Vermont that overwhelmingly involved anti-Zionist harassment and discrimination. So you had a sexual assault survivor support group, the largest support group on campus, thousands of students, that after the 2021 Gaza conflict posted that they were blocking Zionists. And when Jewish students reached out to try and have a conversation, they said, no, we don't talk to Zionists. You had a book club called the Revolutionary Socialist Union Book Club that advertised on the university's website with the other book clubs, that had students had to pledge no to a whole list of things in order to belong to this book club, and it included pledging no to racism and Islamophobia and homophobia. And you had to pledge no to anti-Semitism, but you also had to pledge no to Zionism to be a member of this book club. And then you had a teaching assistant who thrilled to just, this again is in 2021, to vilifying Jewish students and Zionists online, right? She would talk about how she gets a serotonin rush from bullying the Zionist in the public domain. She would talk about how where there was somebody who stole an Israeli flag from outside a residence where Jewish students lived, and they didn't know who did it. And she put out on social media praising the person who did it, calling them the Spider-Man of Burlington, anonymously doing good by stealing this Israeli flag. And then she had one tweet where she said, "Is it unethical for me, a TA, to deny participation credit to Zionists? I think it would be good and funny," she says, -5 points for going on Birthright in 2018, -10 points for posting a pic of yourself with a tank in the Golan Heights, and -2 points just because I hate your vibe in general. And the Department of Education looked at all of this, and they treated it as what they called a form of national origin discrimination on the basis of shared ancestry. And they said universities have to revise their policies to make sure that they're covering and addressing this kind of harassment and discrimination.
Let me ask a very technical question then. What about people who convert to Judaism? They don't have shared national ancestry.
I actually think that if you believe, which Jews do, that all souls were at Har Sinai, right, then even those who were converting in, the belief is that their souls were there too. So what happened in the intervening generations, I don't know. But they also, this is their ancestry too, because they were there at Har Sinai at Matan Torah.
Right. But on a legal level, I assume the courts won't accept that argument.
Well, once you have joined, right, the Jewish people, I think I don't think the courts, right? If you're the other piece I should say is that the law recognizes actual or perceived shared ancestry. So you don't even actually have to be, if you're being targeted on the basis. So for instance, we had a case where there was a middle school student who, if you remember years ago when Israel's international baseball team had that like Cinderella story.
Sure.
So this kid was in middle school and he loved baseball, and somebody gave him an Israeli baseball jersey, and he wore it to school one day. He wasn't even Jewish. He wore it to school one day. The kids in the middle school had a class on the Holocaust, and they started calling him a dirty Jew, asking him where his number was tattooed on his arm. And this is before predates October 7th. Told him he should go to the ovens. And this bullying continued for a couple of years in middle school. And the kid hid it initially from his parents. Like, they're not Jewish. Like, it's not. And it got so bad that by high school, he ended up having to leave the school because they were tormenting him constantly. So, yes, and we filed a complaint, and the Department of Education treated it as this form of discrimination, recognizing that you don't have to be Jewish, but if you're being targeted on the basis of that perception, that's enough.
Okay, that's really important distinction. I appreciate that. And what a terrible story as well. Let's go back to my initial question, though.
Yes.
In terms of the United States and freedom of speech and the protection afforded and accorded to freedom of speech, which again is a good thing, is there anything that can be done when we get to situations like globalize the Intifada or other chants of that nature, which can be understood by those who want to defend them as, I'm not calling for violence?
So I do think that once you understand the framing, once you understand the impact, then you can begin to have a better sense of when this protected speech is actually crossing the line into directed harassment, discrimination, and threats. So, if you have a group that's standing and abiding by what we call the time, place, and manner restrictions, right there in their designated space, they're not trailing or following or encircling or blocking or getting in the personal space of Jews who may be passing by or maybe, right, they are just over there holding up signs that we find completely offensive. That's a difficult case. But when you have the much more direct interaction, that's when there needs to be this understanding that these comments are being made in a manner that's gloating about a barbaric attack that targeted Jews in the most horrific way. And what those who are shouting it are basically saying is, we celebrate this. We want to repeat this. We want to see more of this happen to you, right? And so once you start to understand that that's what this is really about, then I think you can start to have the courts recognize, okay, this is not just some statement about what's going on in Gaza or some statement about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and these people are just demonstrating and sharing their political opinion, a good faith political opinion. They will be able to start to say, okay, this is now crossing the line. And I think we're inching towards that because what happened in Bondi Beach was foreseeable. It was horrible, but foreseeable, because what has been going unchecked for all these years is the vilification of Jews. Einat Wilf calls it the placard strategy. I don't know if you're familiar. She says on the campuses, you saw for years the messaging and the shouting and the distorted narrative could all be boiled down to what was basically a very simple equation that you would see sometimes on the signs, which were that the Magen David, right, the Star of David, equals the Zionist, equals whatever that evil concept is. It's shifted over the years. It started with apartheid, ethnic cleansing. Now you see genocide, famine. But those concepts were never offered on the campus to actually start a discussion or a debate about whether it meets the standards of apartheid or genocide. No, those equations were meant to drum into the heads of the whole community that would listen that Jew is a Zionist is evil. That Jew is a Zionist is evil. And as Einat says, right, after October 7th, you started to see a new sign on campus, which was, let's keep our campus clean with the Magen David in the trash can. Because if you understand how anti-Semitism works, right, that's the other piece. People need to understand what's going on. They need to understand not only how Jews define their Jewishness, but they need to understand how anti-Semitism works. And anti-Semitism goes in cycles, right? Throughout history, you have Jewish communities that have become very successful, integrated into the communities that they're living in countries around the world. And then, like on a dime, it feels like it turns. The society's unhealthy. They look for someone to blame. And the Jew is always, 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 throughout history, is always the scapegoat. Always. And so what the Jewish community now today in America and in European countries, right, around the world are feeling is, these unhealthy societies are turning on the Jew. And the Jew is again becoming the scapegoat. And if the idea was that the way anti-Semitism would work is it would demonize the Jew, dehumanize the Jew, and then push the Jew out of acceptable society, today, what's different? We don't have just individual Jews scattered around the globe. Today, we actually have a Jewish collective. We have a Jewish nation state of Israel. And as Erwin Cutler, used to say Erwin Cutler is the former justice minister in Canada and was their first special envoy on monitoring and combating anti-Semitism. He's a renowned international human rights lawyer and scholar. But he said, if traditional anti-Semitism sought to deny individual Jews their place in society, today's anti-Semitism is seeking to do the same to the Jewish collective, to the Jewish nation state of Israel. It's seeking to push it out of the society of nations. There's no other country that's told it has no right to exist. Right? The answer suddenly is, oh yes, we're just going to get rid of Israel. They don't say that about, right, any other country, not North Korea, not Iran, right, not Russia, not China, none of these, right? The only Israel, right? Because this is the anti-Semitism of today, is the anti-Semitism that's treating Israel as the Jewish collective and seeking to push it out of the society of nations.
I know Rabbi Sachs said something very similar, that there's always a type of Jew who's not acceptable. Once upon a time, we're not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Judaism. That was the Catholic Church's line. Later on, it was, we're not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Israel, et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to ask you about something you alluded to a few moments ago in terms of, you said about people blocking other people. And one of the things, getting back to the campus, that I always found really troubling, I'd see these videos of these encampments, and there would be people surrounding an obviously Jewish student and not allowing them to get through, to get to their class or to get to where they wanted to go. And they kept on making it clear if the Jew would push them aside, that would be assault and they'd be criminally liable. And I wanted to understand legally who's right. Meaning, is it true that if you block a Jew from getting to his class and the Jew pushes you out of the way when 5 people are making a human wall to stop you, the person who pushed, the Jewish person, is the one who actually can be prosecuted?
So the schools, okay, and one of the things that we pushed for is that schools should make their time, place, and manner restrictions clear and enforce them. So most schools have on their books that you are not permitted to block an individual's access. You can demonstrate, but you can't disrupt the classes, you can't block access to the buildings. And if a student violates that, they need to be held accountable by the school for breaking that rule. By the same token, it is true that if an individual actually touches, right, assaults, pushes, that is by law an assault. So you do have situations, and it's frustrating, but it is something that the Jewish community needs to be careful about, where you've had students who will hear things shouted and said that are tremendously offensive. They are really nasty, horrible, but the person's staying, they're not blocking where they're supposed to, the access, they're not. And Jewish students have then engaged and pushed, or, and the Jewish student has ended up then being prosecuted because that student shouting the horrible stuff is abiding by their rules, standing in their protected space, wherever it is, and not actually physically engaging. On the other hand, as I say, if they are starting to block access, surround them, follow them, get in their space, then you may be crossing the line to harassment. And that's where the Jewish students need to be able to then file and say, I'm being harassed. Why? Not because I find their sign offensive, but because they've crossed the line and they're now entering my space. They're following me. They're targeting me. They're coming after me. That can be a much more directed harassment, and that can be actionable.
Well, I still want to ask about that. Let's say, for example, there is actionable harassment, but the Jewish person also does touch that guy to get out of the way. Does that remain actionable against the Jewish person, even though they were wrong in their harassment?
Under the law, you would want them to touch you first, right? In other words, if you're defending yourself, that's a different story. But if you start it,
even if starting it means you're being harassed, but you're the first person to touch somebody, that's what you mean by starting it, right?
Yeah, exactly. You should be walking. You should be. If they completely block your access, which is what happened with the encampments, that's actionable, right? They couldn't get through. And the fact that the school did not take the steps to make sure that the students had access is what made the school liable, because they didn't turn around and enforce their own rules to make sure that these students were protected, right? That's how that works.
I'm still surprised, though. I mean, I understand it's true, but I have to get to my final exam. And they're blocking my access to the final exam, and they won't let me through. And I push them just so I can get to my class and get to my exam. Yes, it's actionable against them, but I can still be prosecuted. That's what you're saying.
Because that's exactly how these opponents are taught to work, right? They are the folks who are responsible for the encampments, the folks who are responsible for this harassment, are part of a very well-organized, very strategic, well-funded campaign. That's quite frankly about more than just blocking students' access on campus. I'll share with you one story, though, to give you an idea of why were these encampments even possible at this point. So it's because, right, in 2018, I'll give you an example of what happened. 2018, NYU, okay, their student government at NYU in 2018 adopted a BDS resolution. This is back when people are thinking, BDS, what is BDS, right? How impactful is that? But they passed, their student government, a BDS resolution, which said, we are not only boycotting Israeli companies, we're not going to buy sabra hummus, right? But we're boycotting all the companies that do business with Israel. But they said, we're going to boycott all the pro-Israel groups on campus, which basically means all the Jewish groups on campus. And they said, we're not going to engage with them. We won't co-sponsor events with them. The school realized, to its credit, that this is not a good thing to have students boycotting students. So they brought in a professional facilitator to come to facilitate a dialogue because 53 student organizations endorsed this resolution and said, we're going to follow it. So you now had 53 student orgs, your whole progressive community on campus, that weren't going to engage with the Jewish orgs. They brought in this facilitator, and what was supposed to be a 1.5-hour dialogue, just a discussion among the group, turned into a 2.5-hour discussion because the facilitator said, we're going to have a dialogue. This is not a debate, right? We're here to just go around and respectfully listen one to the other. Debate would be where I try and convince you I'm right, you're wrong. This is a dialogue, not a debate. It was supposed to be a 1.5-hour dialogue turned into a 2.5-hour discussion about whether the anti-Zionists would even talk to the Zionists. They said, we showed up here because we didn't want to risk losing our student government funding, but you can't force us to talk. There was one Palestinian student in the room. I heard this because I spoke to several of the Jewish students who had been there. And this one Palestinian student said, I don't understand it. The Jewish students seem to want to hear my story, but my allies won't let me tell it. And after 2.5 hours, the facilitator gave up. She said, I can't force you to talk. She sent them home. And the school announced, because part of this resolution was pushing the school to divest. They said, we're not divesting from Israel, which is very nice. But it did nothing to address this interpersonal issue between the students. And that issue just continued to grow on campuses. We saw it on campuses across the country because, as I say, the issue back then wasn't a political debate. And here's how the Jewish orgs that were working in that space inadvertently made the problem worse back then. Because what happened is the Jewish organizations saw these students who came to campus. They saw how they were being bombarded with these lies about Israel, with this disinformation. And they thought, oh my goodness, these students, they barely know Jewish history. They certainly don't know Israel's history. We have to give them Israel's narrative to be able to push back. And so they put together all these beautiful booklets and talking points. And the students went out there and dutifully gave Israel's story. And it didn't move the needle one whit because these groups didn't care about that wasn't their goal to engage in this conversation. And the only problem is that for the observers, for the administrators who were watching, now they thought they really had that good faith, robust debate going on because now they saw both sides. So they weren't going to silence either side. They weren't going to pick a side. And they were totally missing how one side was doing this to just dehumanize the Jews while the other side was desperately trying to engage on the facts. And that's part of one of the issues, I think, that the Jewish community, in terms of our approach, that's been a mistake in our approach. You have to think very carefully about who you're trying to engage in the actual conversation about the political issues with. Is it somebody that really wants to have that good faith conversation? Because there are many people out there who are not interested in it. And so while our side needs to be educated, we need to know. By the same token, we need to be calling out the haters who are just spewing this out of hate. And we haven't even touched on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, but I actually think that is the key tool to help society understand the difference between a political debate, which is what the IRA definition calls criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country. That's not anti-Semitism. That's your political debate. And the 3Ds, right? Natan Sharansky set out the 3Ds of demonize, delegitimize, and double standard. That's basically what the IHRA definition incorporates, which says that anti-Semitism is when you're going to demonize Jews or Israel as the Jewish collective. Israel is that evil, conniving, bloodthirsty, like the caricature of the Jew. That's not a discussion about policy. That's just Israel is evil. The double standard, that's the crux of discriminatory treatment, is when you're going to apply a double standard to one group and treat them differently. So if you're going to apply a double standard to Jews or to Israel as the Jewish collective, that's anti-Semitism. And here's the delegitimize. Delegitimize is defined as the example, right, is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. The IHRA definition talks about, e.g., by calling Israel a racist endeavor. In 2010, the State Department, this is 6 years before IRA was passed, they adopted their own definition of anti-Semitism that was based on the precursor. The language is a little bit different. It's almost identical, but their The way they define delegitimization is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by suggesting Israel has no right to exist. So now if you think about why is suggesting Israel has no right to exist or saying Israel's a racist endeavor, why is this not a political debate, but it's anti-Semitic? And I suggest to you focus on this first part, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. What we're seeing today is a very deliberate effort to erase and deny the idea that the Jews are a people or that we have any history in the land of Israel. And so if you're going to deny the Jewish people their right to self-determination, what you're really doing is erasing and denying the way Jews have defined what it means to be Jewish for millennia. The narrative that's being taught today on campuses across the United States, and this is not just universities, this is now spreading down to K through 12, is a narrative that goes like this. It says every human being that ever lived in the Holy Land since creation is Palestinian. Yes, it says there were Jews, there were Christians, there were Muslims, but those were just faith-based religious identities. According to this narrative, the cultural or ethnic identity of every human being was Palestinian, and that includes Jesus. And then they say, we know the difference between the Jew and the Zionist. The Jew, they say, recognizes that Judaism is just a faith. The Zionists, they accuse of stealing Palestinian history and heritage and culture and calling it Jewish. And now they have a term called anti-Palestinian racism, which they've tried to get ensconced into law in Canada, and now they're trying in California. And the idea of this definition of what is it, anti-Palestinian racism, it's defined so broadly as to encompass anything that pushes back against this narrative that I just described. So if you say, wait a minute, I believe that I, as a Jew, am part of a people that has a long history here in this land as a people, no, now you're a racist, because now you're stealing the Palestinian history and heritage.
What you're saying is so troubling, and it resonates so much also with some other things I'm learning right now. I happen to be reading a book for the second time because it's worth reading for everybody by James Carroll called Constantine's Sword, about the history of Christian and specifically Roman Catholic anti-Semitism. Just yesterday, I read a passage where he talked about the burning of the Talmud, I believe in 1242 in Paris, by Louis XIV, King of France. And the reason he said this was a very dangerous development, aside from inherently burning books being a bad thing, this was the first time that Christians decided they would define Judaism for Jews. They said the Talmud is heretical for Jews. Not that we find it offensive to Christians, that we already know, but it was suddenly decided that Jews have to be X and the Talmud is Y, and therefore we are going to tell you what is heretical for you. That same insidious process is clearly manifest in what you're describing right now. Non-Jews telling Jews what it means to be a Jewish person.
Exactly right. And we saw this over and over again. This is, again, before October 7th. When I first met with Jewish students on campus and they were feeling this, they would tell me about all the messaging that they found, disturbing and upsetting. But I had to keep talking to them to find that at the end of almost every single story, I would hear like what had happened at NYU, which was that when they actually tried to engage in the conversation, they were not just shut down, they were told, forget it, get out of here. Then initially the term was anti-normalization. We can't normalize the relations with you. Now you hear, oh, we won't talk to the oppressor. Like you're the oppressor, we won't even have the conversation with you. And so what I said, and the way these students started to push back was to say, wait a minute, who are you to tell me what it means to be Jewish, right? Because what these groups were saying to them is, unless you accept our definition of what it means to be Jewish, which is this horrible, evil thing that why would anybody want to be that? But you have to accept that. And if you accept that, then maybe we'll, consider accepting you, of course, after you've done, repented for that who you are. But the truth is it's a major threat, if you ask me, to just the continuity of the Jewish people, because the students on campus today are being put to this horrible test, right? You have Jews who you go back to when you were asking what defines the Jewish people, but you have Jews in America and around the world who this is the thread that's keeping them connected to the Jewish people. They still feel part of the Jewish people. And what they're being told now is that thread makes you unacceptable to us. So you have a choice. You can either have friends or or you hold on to that thread. And if you hold on to that thread, you don't have any friends. And so students on campus responded one of two ways. Either they held on to that thread and they started to come inside the Jewish bubble, which is why the Hillels and the Chabads on campus were reporting record numbers of engagement, because these students who had always engaged outside the bubble, outside the Jewish bubble, now felt that the only place they really could fully be themselves was inside the Jewish bubble. And it was a huge opportunity. It still is a huge opportunity because these students now are learning more about what that Jewish identity is. But then you also have the others who decided, I don't really know very much about this thread. Why is it that important? I'll just snip it and have my friends.
Let me ask you, Alyza, you mentioned before that the NYU students unintentionally fed into the narrative almost and allowed the administration to say, look, there's a dialogue, when in fact one group was refusing to engage in dialogue and the Jewish students mistakenly did the wrong thing. What should they have done instead? What would have been the correct response?
Yeah, so I think today, and I think there are more today that recognize it, is not to take the bait. Don't try and engage with the student who is demanding, right, that you shed your Jewishness in order to be accepted. Push back and say, you, like you just said, you have no right to tell me what it means to be Jewish. I am a proud Jew. I will remain a proud Jew, and I have every right to fully engage in society, in campus, in activities as a fully, openly proud Jew. That needs to be the response. And don't try and tell me that the Jews are not a people. Don't try and erase our history in the land of Israel. It's deceitful. It's lies. It's not, this is who we are. This is our history. This is our heritage. This is our peoplehood. This is what Zionism is, right? Zionism is our collective yearning as a people for the ingathering of the exiles, that one day we'll all return to our ancestral homeland. But I, as a Jew, recognize that I am part of a people. I actually think that if you want a definition for Zionist, and it would apply to Jews or non-Jews, a Zionist is one who recognizes that the Jews are a people indigenous to Judea. We recognize that we are a people with an ancestral history. Whether you're Christian, whether you're Jewish, if you recognize that the Jews are not just a faith, they're also a people, indigenous to that land, you are a Zionist. You can have whatever political opinions you want. You can be pro-Netanyahu, you can be anti-Netanyahu, you can be pro-two states, anti-two states, whatever it is. You are a Zionist if you recognize that the Jews are a people indigenous to the land of Israel.
In that case, do you think it might be worthwhile to do basically the impossible and retire the term Zionist or Zionism because it's simply Judaism? And by not allowing it to be separated, we can say, that's simply Judaism. You're asking me not to be Jewish anymore. And yes, there are people out there in the Torah Karta, even they will say, yes, the Jews are a people. Yes, Israel is that people's ancestral homeland to which one day they will return. According to your definition, they are in that category of Zionists, whether they like it or not. The only people who are not Zionists and are still Jews are Jews who are completely ignorant of their own heritage, the JVP people, etc.
Yeah. So the first answer is no. I do not think we should retire the word Zionism. I actually think we have to reclaim Zionism and the term Zionism. I think it's very important to reclaim Zionism. But as far as the second piece, if you think about it, the first time in history, I think, that Jews disavowed this idea of peoplehood, this connection to Jews around the world, this ancestral connection to Israel, was, I think, in 1789, when the Jews of France were offered emancipation, right? There was a debate in the French Parliament about whether or not the Declaration of Rights of Man should apply to Jews. I chuckle because there was no discussion about whether or not it should apply to women. That was clearly no. But Jews was an extended debate. And what they concluded was that for Jews as individuals, they should give everything. But Jews as a people, nothing. Right? How could you decide that you were going to make someone a French citizen if that person somehow felt connected to the Jew in England or the Jew in Germany? So the Jews then, there are letters from the leadership of the Jewish community basically saying to the Jews, don't mess this up. Like, we've always been second-class citizens. This is the first time we can have full equal rights. Religion could be something private, right, in the home, but we're Frenchmen. France is our Zion. And the same thing happened about 6 or 7 years later in the Dutch parliament. And the Dutch actually drafted an oath that they wanted the Jews to say, I so-and-so hereby declare that I do not belong to any other people nor any other part of any other people, but solely and only to the people of the Netherlands. Same thing. You have to pledge allegiance only to us. And that started the shift. And if you think about it, Theodor Herzl, when he started his political movement of Zionism, he was initially surprised. It wasn't the Western Europeans that were his primary followers. It was the Eastern European Jews, who he called his schleppers. But think about it. The Eastern European Jews that have been pushed into the Pale of Settlement, they never had to shed this part of their Jewishness that defined us as a people yearning for our return to our ancestral homeland. So for them, this Zionism resonated because it spoke to their Jewishness. So when I look at today's JVP Jews or others, I think, you know what, historically, we've had that before, where there are Jews who have said, it's more important to me, the people right now here in my community, my immediate neighborhood. I'm not worried about the Jews around the world, right? I live here in the diaspora. This is what's important to me. And I'm not yearning for the rebuilding of Zion. Okay. I think that for the strength and the continuity, and I'm the optimist. I actually, I think that you cannot look at what's happened over the last 2 years and with all the pain still not see the hand of God in what has happened. And when I would look, as I say to you, even on the campuses, the idea that you had this awakening, this sense of Jewish peoplehood among Jews who were not giving their Jewishness a second thought. And now suddenly they're expressing how much they feel connected, not just to Jews in their community and seeking out the synagogues, or even in businesses. We had a rise in what are called employee resource groups, ERGs, where Jews after October 7th were looking to be able to gather with other Jews. I call these the Hillels of the workplace, because they felt they needed that community. They needed that support. They didn't have it anywhere else, right? So Jews were coming into these communities, seeking Jewish peoplehood, seeking the strengthening of those bonds, not just locally, but internationally, right? Feeling connected to Jews in Israel. And then the other piece that to me is remarkable is that you now have hostages who have returned, who are openly speaking about faith and how it was faith that gave them the strength to endure experiences that are unfathomable. And so if it's faith that gave them that strength, imagine what faith could do to help just individuals deal with whatever their challenges are that they experience. So I've spoken to rabbis, like there's a Zionist conference of rabbis. I said, rabbis, what a moment. You have people seeking community, seeking Jewish peoplehood, and you have the opportunity to talk about faith. Don't blow it, because I have every confidence that when we as a people get through this ring of fire and get to the other end, we will come through a better educated, more cohesive, more empathetic, just much stronger, and hopefully more united people at the end. So I have hope.
That's a beautiful sentiment. Alyza, I still have one more thing I have to ask about, even though I would love to end on such a hopeful note. Nevertheless, there's one more category and topic I want to ask you about, and that's the category of Islamophobia and the way it often is paired with anti-Semitism. Many of us are troubled by the fact they're paired together, not because we're Islamophobic per se, but because it seems to be almost de rigueur. If you condemn anti-Semitism, you must also, at the same time, in the same breath, condemn Islamophobia or anti-Muslim bigotry. Part of my question is, first of all, is that a fair thing? But the second question really is, I'm not even sure that the two phenomena are parallel, because someone who has a bias against Muslims as people, well, that's anti-Muslim bigotry, and that's not acceptable. That's completely wrong. When we talk about Islamophobia, if by that I mean that I'm afraid of Islam as a political philosophy as it's expressed in certain countries such as Iran, or through the political philosophy of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, then that's not something which we have to say is a bad thing. Of course I'm against the Islam as expressed in some of these terrorist groups and countries. So if I'm going to say that Islamophobia is unacceptable. Isn't it possible, though? I don't mean Muslims. I mean the political philosophy that is associated with certain groups in Islam, the same way that I can talk about the political philosophy of communism. If I'm an anti-communist, that doesn't make me a bigot. If I'm against Islamofascism as a kind of political philosophy, if I don't want that, that doesn't make me a bigot either. And I realize I might be falling into a serious trap here because I mentioned before that the Catholic Church used to say anti-Semitism is unacceptable, but anti-Judaism is acceptable. And on some level, I'm doing the same thing here. Anti-Muslim bigotry is not acceptable, but being afraid of Islam as a philosophy, that is okay. So maybe I'm doing the same thing. I want to know what you think about all of this.
So I do think that the term Islamophobia was originated really as an attempt to silence the Jewish, or what was seen as either the Jewish narrative. It has been used to just silence any critics. And you're right, it's been used to silence critics who want to engage in the conversation. Even going back, right? If you'd have students who would try to engage on the merits of the political debate, oftentimes the way to discredit or use a slur kind of almost was, well, now you're an Islamophobe. Now you're being Islamophobic. And that
we saw this with Zoran Mamdani. It's a very recent example where any criticism of his anti-Zionist positions was then called a form of Islamophobia. You're just being Islamophobic.
Exactly. And so there's no, it prevents any of the ability for the discussion. Now, before I came to the Brandeis Center, and I have a law practice with my father, I've done a lot of work in the religious liberty space, specifically working to try and make sure that members of faith-based communities can practice their faith in this country. Muslims should be able to practice their faith, right? Discriminating against a Muslim and preventing, religious belief, religious practice, that is protected. The problem when you link anti-Semitism and Islamophobia the way the Biden administration did regularly, for example, was that it defined Islamophobia so broadly as to always undermine any efforts to protect against anti-Semitism. So that's the example, for instance, when I talk about how you define anti-Palestinian racism, it's similar, right? If you are going to say that the mere expression of my Jewishness is now somehow racist, this is similarly, I think, what's happened in terms of how the use of the term Islamophobic has been used. Until you had the term anti-Palestinian racism, folks would use the word Islamophobic. So if you're trying to say, no, this person, right, you want to use Mamdani as the example. Mamdani will only recognize the anti-Semitism that has no relationship to Israel. So for him, anti-Semitism is limited to targeting a Jew on the basis of their religious belief, their religious practice, or their Jewish religious appearance. But if it is targeting a Jew on the basis of their peoplehood, on the basis of the Jewish ancestral connection to Israel, trying to erase and deny that, right? Trying to suggest that Israel is evil, as we just said, not on the basis of policies, but it's demonizing the collective Jew or the double standard, that none of that is anti-Semitism to him. And if somebody tries to say, wait a minute, no, that is also anti-Semitism, and you are now engaging in anti-Semitism, now you're an Islamophobe. That's the way it's used to just prevent the ability to even have a conversation or recognize any anti-Semitism related to Israel. That's it. And there are those in this world who want that to be the case. They want that anti-Semitism should only be when it targets Jews on the basis of their religious belief and their religious practice. Anything else, anything I sprinkle in the word Israel, I sprinkle in the word Zionist, that automatically makes it a political debate and it's not about the Jew. That's malarkey. It's just ridiculous. You can't separate. You cannot say I support Jews, but I oppose Zionists, because Zionism is an integral component for most Jews of what it means to be Jewish.
Okay, Alyza, as we conclude, let me ask you a final question. Just to bring it all home, if you could give advice to Jewish community leaders, both in and outside the Orthodox world, a type of strategic playbook for the next year, for the next 12 months, as we're entering 2026, to defend public Jewish life without Jews retreating into a state of fear and panic, what would you tell them? You already mentioned to emphasize faith. So alongside that, what else would you say that Jewish leaders should be doing right now?
So number one, I know it gets increasingly difficult and frightening, right, after Bondi Beach, but we have to still be openly, proudly Jewish. That's number one. I saw stories afterwards about folks who were wondering, well, should we still put up, our outdoor menorah? Should we have our Hanukkah decorations on display? And the answer should be yes. We can't go into hiding. We're not going to solve this problem by going into hiding. So number one, we need to have the courage and the strength to be proud, be openly Jewish. Number two, we need to recognize when what's happening is the vilification of Jews and not a political debate. And don't take the bait. Don't start talking about the politics when the person on the other side is just dehumanizing you as a Jew. If that's what's happening, you have to call out that dehumanization. You have to say, like you were saying earlier, don't tell me what it means to be Jewish. I will tell you what it means to be Jewish. This is the beauty of my Judaism, right? This is what it means to me to be Jewish. And part of what it means to me to be Jewish is to recognize my Jewish peoplehood, to take pride in our history and our heritage, which is inextricably rooted in the land of Israel. You cannot separate the Jewish people from our history in the land of Israel. That is where our identity as a people was solidified, was cemented, right? And you can never take that away from the Jewish people. And we're proud of that, and we will always be proud of that. So that's two. Openly, proudly Jewish, embrace Jewish peoplehood, embrace our ancestral connection to Israel. If we can start there, as you say, and then the next piece is to really use that language, I think, to help strengthen our unity. Jews define their Jewishness in many different ways, and we are very good at arguing with each other, but that's not helpful. It weakens us. Our enemies see that. That's what happened October 7th. And I think that it's really important for us to find a language that helps us bring the Jewish people together, celebrate our history and heritage, teach those who may not know as much about our history and heritage, more about our history and heritage, help those who may not have found faith, at least on an intellectual level, understand how those who have found faith feel it strengthens and enriches their life. Let them see it, let them hear it. And then maybe as we work together more as a united community, I tell you, like that's how we'll get through and become at the end a better educated, stronger, united people. I mean, this is, I think, the key language that we need to understand and strengthen. That's my hope.
Sounds good to me. Amen. Alyza Lewin, I really appreciate you joining me today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Before we sign off, a brief word of thanks. Several new listeners have joined our Patreon, and I'm genuinely grateful. You're not buying bonus episodes. You're underwriting the work, the research, editing, and the independence that lets us ask hard questions with respect and clarity. If today's conversation helped you think more carefully about Torah, community, and the world we inhabit, please consider becoming a patron. Even a small monthly contribution makes a real difference in keeping the Orthodox Conundrum going and accessible to everyone. The link is in the show notes. To those who have already joined, thank you. Your vote of confidence means more than you know. And to everyone else, I hope you'll consider joining us. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at Alyza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com.